you're all here clearly because there's something big that's occurring in a few weeks' time. We're here to help you as financial planners cut through the speculation and make better informed decisions based on what we expect could be coming up. So we're joined here today by two distinguished speakers in their own right, very well renowned in the areas they operate in. And the first will be joined by a lady called Dr. Rebecca Harding and questioned by partner here at Foresight, Huggy Clark. There'll be a time for questions at the end as well.
I'm not one of the distinguished speakers, in case you're wondering. You notice he said two? I was like, hang on.
Now, without butchering Rebecca's fantastic biography, I will read this verbatim. So, Dr. Rebecca Harding is a senior fellow of the British Foreign Policy Group, an associate at Arundel Associates, an independent trade economist and strategic advisor to financial services organisation. Amongst the many accomplishments in the business world, Rebecca was chief economist at the Work Foundation and at UK Finance. Rebecca acted as a specialist advisor to the Treasury Select Committee and advised the all-party parliamentary group on entrepreneurship. So pretty sophisticated individual in the areas that we're going to be talking about today. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Huggy to start.
Thank you, Charlie. And thank you, Rebecca, for joining us. Charlie's just given us a bit of a rundown of the CV, but for people who still aren't familiar, in your own words, why don't you tell us a bit about who you are?
So the doctor gives it away. I'm a lapsed academic economist. You can all feel sorry for me now. I have done a lot of work. I've set up 3 data companies and sold them on, and I do a lot of work around trade, supply chains, investment, trade finance, and I work with a lot of banks on managing their supply chains, managing their supply chain finance. But I've also written a couple of books. Well, I've written 10 books actually, but I've written 2 that are particularly relevant to the current environment that we live in. So one's called The Weaponisation of Trade, and I wrote that a few years ago when President Trump first started saying that China was an enemy. And it was a big shift from all of these sort of multilateral things that we've been talking about, opportunities for all. And I suddenly realised we were starting to use really weaponised language around the things that we all do. Businesses trade with each other, and all of a sudden across borders we were starting to talk about this all being weaponised. So I wrote a book then, and I wrote a subsequent book called Gaming Trade, looking at the geopolitics of trade and supply chains and investment and finance and economics. And as a corollary to that, I now work with the British Foreign Policy Group, with Arundel, on understanding some of the defence and security consequences of, let's just call it economic statecraft, but a lot of people are calling it economic warfare.
And Labour policy is kind of the central topic for today, but generally in the market, I understand you have a special insight there. Can you just tell us a bit about where that comes from?
Yeah, so in the early part of my career, I was chief economist at the Work Foundation, and the Work Foundation back in the day was very close to Labour, so and the Blair government. So I sort of feel what goes around comes around. We were working at the time with a lot of the key people, Gordon Brown, Patricia Hewitt, so on, and I advised the Treasury Select Committee at that time. I looked at regional productivity, I looked at regional growth. It was kind of precursor to the levelling up agenda that we saw under the Conservative government, and now of course the jobs and growth focus that the government is specialising in is very much a product of what we saw in the past. So also through the British Foreign Policy Group, I have links into the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and through some of the other networks also other bits of the government, including security and defence. So yeah, that's me, that's why. And
I've been trying to figure out how to characterise Labour's start, and I've decided interesting is probably the most neutral, perhaps not quite the first 80 days or so that they would have wanted, but it's the speculation in the market, I guess, that's getting people twitchy. There's not much confirmed. There are lots of stories about where they might go. The message seems to be that it's going to be painful. Yeah. What's your understanding of the policy priorities of this government?
So this government has prioritised jobs and economic growth above everything else. So it's said, I mean, yesterday Rachel Reeves said no return to austerity, but there was never going to be any big policy announcements. And I think I think if I'm honest about it, I would say the government itself coming in has been a little bit shocked at the state of play. So that's across all spectrums of government. It's not just the economic framework, it's foreign policy, it's defence policy, it's everything. So I kind of think Keir Starmer is a little bit like Mario Draghi. He's a technocrat. He's not a fascinating, stunning guy who's suddenly going to stand up and with all that charisma that Tony Blair had, set the world on fire, and suddenly we're all going to be cool Britannia again and everything. He's very, very, very detailed. That doesn't necessarily make for good government. I mean, if you remember, the reason why Tony Blair and Gordon Brown fell out was because actually Gordon Brown was a technocrat. He wanted to micromanage lots of little bits of the economy. And Keir Starmer's very similar. Now, Rachel Reeves is a macroeconomist. She understands investment markets. She understands the budgeting process. What they are trying to do at the moment is steady the ship. It's just that they're steadying it in a really miserable way. They're saying this ship's wobbling. Everybody knows the ship's wobbling. People want to be told this ship is going to be steadied, and I think that's the problem. And you've seen a slight shift in emphasis this week. Keir Starmer will stand up going this afternoon and say it's not going to be easy, but we're going to get there. Rachel Reeves' message yesterday was very much along the lines of, actually, we don't want to return to austerity. You know, all of these things, all of these concerns, let's shut the door on the bad news that's happened over the summer, and let's have a think about where we go now, because we are going to have to make some tough choices. There is this 22 billion black hole, and we are going to have to make some tough choices, and it will undoubtedly fall on investment communities, on richer people who are going to find it more difficult. And you know, we're beginning to see some nervousness around capital moving out of markets, you know, non-doms, etc. And I think they need to manage all of those messages very, very carefully indeed, because unless you see some hope, capital flight is very easy. It's very easy to put money somewhere else, and it's too risky to be perpetually negative. And if you look at Rishi Sunak, for example, he was perpetually negative, and that's one of the reasons why he got voted out. You know, it's just like, we can't stand any more of this gloom. We need something to hold on to. I think Labour will begin to give us something to hold on to, but they won't give us policies. But they will give us a light on the horizon, if you like. But the other big problem, and I think this is really serious, is they don't know what they're dealing with yet. The US election hasn't happened. That's going to shift the global economy massively. It's either going to shift the global economy massively and America will become more isolationist, or everybody will relax for 4 years and go, right, okay, Europe, America, the UK, AUKUS, we're all going to be working together, and actually we're going to be building up a resistance to what is seen as China's geo-economic dominance. So he doesn't know where all of that sits, so it's very, very difficult at the moment. But basically, jobs growth and stability, and also foreign policy dictated to by climate change to some extent, and climate risk.
And so it's kind of one of the reasons I describe Labour's start as interesting. What you're describing there is almost a lack of activity while they work out how the land lies. So I suppose there's two questions that arise from that. Firstly, when do you think we'll start to see policy? And ultimately, what kind of policy do you think we'll start to see?
So we have to see policy by the 30th of October, because economic policy will be put into a framework of a budget. So, I mean, the key thing for an investor audience is obviously what the fiscal stance of the government is going to be and how that plays into people's pockets. Now, the problem that Rachel Reeves has is obviously that the country is massively underinvested, and I'm sure we'll come on to that in a little while. But I think we'll start to see policy after the budget, because that will lay out the framework of expenditure. And I mean, to reiterate, this is going to be a very technocratic government. Nobody is going to be waving flags on the rooftops and singing and dancing about this government. It's going to be very technocratic. never have a government run by a cross between economists, accountants and lawyers. It doesn't make for interesting sound bites. But I think that technocratic approach is actually quite necessary if we're going to fix the UK economy. So I think, yeah, budget, and then after that we'll start to see some big things happening. And to be fair, they have done a few things. They have awarded the public sector pay increases that particularly the NHS was looking for. Junior doctors, senior doctors, nurses have rejected theirs. They've got the train drivers back. Has anybody noticed the train drivers being back? But you know, they have started to do one or two things like that. And there is a policy which is behind the scenes, which no one has really noticed at the moment. But they're getting ever closer to Germany, that's significant because it's around defence supply chains. It's saying we are going to have European relations that are closer. We're going to build those closer relationships with Germany and not with France, because that's where a lot of the defence supply chains sit. And we're going to get closer with Germany because Germany's been through this big silent vendor and it's committed to spending more money on defence and security, and it's also at the front line of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So there's a big policy shift behind the scenes there that's going on that may affect our defence and security position, but almost certainly will affect our relationship in trade terms with Europe over a period of time. And I suspect what's going on is that we're drawing closer to Germany like that, using NATO as the umbrella, but actually trying to use that to develop closer relationships with the EU, because this government is not going to be able to say we're going back into the single market or we're going back into the customs union. Just not going to be able to say that, but it wants to be closer to our European allies. So that's quite explicit.
So you think the closeness to Germany is a means rather than an end in itself,
yes.
Ultimately?
Yeah, it's a strategic move to try and bring financial services and also industrial supply chains, actually, and industrial policy aligned around a foreign policy agenda. And I think it's going to be very significant, because the problem with Brexit, and the problem any government was going to have with Brexit, and whatever your opinion of Brexit was, going back into Europe is not, into the EU is not an option for any political party, won't be for a generation. So what has to be done, and I think everybody would note the economic consequences of not being in Europe, and there's enough research on all of that to suggest that it's profoundly affected our cost base. Every government will be looking to nudge closer back to Europe without having front page headlines saying we're destroying the spirit of Brexit. So I think this is a way of doing it. It's a way of keeping it off the front pages, but actually signalling that we need closer intelligence, closer defence and closer economic and supply chain relations with Europe.
The budget is obviously the first major set piece event, and you've mentioned the importance for policy. It's important for us as a business operating in the tax efficient space, important for everyone in the room operating as financial planners. What are you expecting to see in the budget?
So I think it's fairly clear that we're going to see tax rises, and those tax rises are going to have to come in the form of capital gains tax, inheritance tax. There'll be some shifts around pensions. If the mood music yesterday was we're not going to see a return to austerity, we are going to see industrial policy, and industrial policy is really significant because Europe now has industrial policy. America has had industrial policy through the Inflation Reduction Act. We have ideologically said for the last 10 years that we're not going to have industrial policy. We don't believe in picking winners. Unfortunately, in a world where economics is highly competitive and even weaponized, we need industrial policy. So there will be industrial policy. And I think the big challenge for Rachel Reeves is actually going to be creating enough slack in the budget to enable investment in infrastructure. So I think we are going to see some big changes in terms of tax. I think we are going to see, they will be big changes that will affect certain certain segments of the community, but they won't necessarily affect the day-to-day for people. She's already said no VAT, she's already said no income tax changes, no national insurance changes, so that's absolutely clear. But there are going to be sort of changes in sort of things that will affect investors and already are affecting investors, if you like, because of the non-doms and so on.
And I might be the only one who feels this way, but I'm trying to quantify this 22 billion gap in terms of GDP and what that means for the size of the changes we'll see. Because on one level, 22 billion is all the money in the world, but on another level, when you think about economies, it's not that much.
Yeah.
Do you think we'll see really drastic changes to the tax system along the lines of the speculation we've seen, or will it be more subtle?
I think we're going to see the big changes at the top end. And I think in terms of additional revenue that those are going to cover. So, I mean, for example, I have to look this up because there are numbers involved. But I mean, if you look at capital gains tax, for example, that raises just over 15 billion at the moment. If it changes in the way that everybody's speculating, then it could raise around another 5 billion more. So those types of things will raise more money, and that's the reason why they're being targeted, because they're seen as redistributive. Now, it doesn't fix the basic problem, which is that Rachel Reeves has a fundamental difficulty, which is that she's committed herself to the debt levels of the last government, which means that she's actually going to need more than 22 billion, or she's going to have to borrow to invest, which is what the Labour Party did under Gordon Brown. There was some murmurings yesterday, and they were only murmurings that might be a change in the mood music, that maybe that particular point has been taken on board. So there might be a little bit more government borrowing. We'll have to wait and see, because these days the budget is defined by what the Office for Budget Responsibility say, and it's also very much dictated to by the forecasts and where the perception of those gaps is going to be. There are huge opportunities, but the big problem is underinvestment in schools, in universities, in hospitals, in police services, public transport. Train drivers again, but that's the big problem. It's huge underinvestment. They've talked about renationalisation of the railways. They've talked about bringing far more of public service under public control. So they're going to need money to be able to do that. They're going to need more than public-private partnerships. They've talked about big investments in a national wealth fund. They've talked about big investments in a green fund. So there are going to be co-investment opportunities out there. They will be looking to draw on the appetite and a risk appetite, if you like, to start getting stuck in on co-investments. We won't see a return to public-private partnerships, but we will be seeing quite a lot more engagement with industry and finance around particularly around energy efficiency and green technologies.
Okay, and on that subject specifically, so it sounds as though you're expecting some major infrastructure investment one way or the other, right across the piece, schools, hospitals, etc. There's also this sort of sustainability tension out there. Sustainability's been something of a mercurial theme, if I can call it that. It seems to rise and fall a little bit in popularity. What are you expecting there, and how do those two things interplay?
So the government has committed to put money into a climate fund, and the amounts of money that are going into it, when you look at the scale of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, or you look at the scale of green investment funds in Europe, which are talking, you are talking tens of billions, hundreds of billions, we're talking 8 billion. So, I mean, it's a drop in the ocean in relation to what's necessary. But the government realises that actually we are one of the most efficient in terms of renewable energies usage in Europe, in fact, in the world. And that's something we can... They want to be seen to be doing something that's leading the way, so we can actually promote more about what we're doing in terms of climate. Now, from an investment point of view, I think this is, again, something that is very important that's coming over from the United States. If you look at, you use the word mercurial, 2 years ago, post-COP 28, we were all going, we're going to be sustainable, we're all going to make a difference, we're going to have net zero, this, that and the other, and we're all going to do it by yesterday and it's going to be fabulous. And the banks that I work with were all saying we have to have sustainability targets, we have to have sustainability metrics, and it's very, very, very difficult to do. Since then, last year we had 5 heat domes, which caused massive high temperatures. This year we've had the highest temperatures on record and ridiculously low temperatures here compared to everybody else. So climate change has become a big thing. Arctic ice caps are melting. People are really aware of climate. And the more aware people become, the more an American constituency, voting constituency in particular, seems to go, well, we don't want to invest in that. That's just woke capitalism. And in Europe, that's actually quite hard to comprehend, because we can't see why it's woke. We think it's something that, is actually an investment opportunity. So, but it's obviously because of the large oil industry in the States. So we've seen this kind of backlash against sustainability investing that's been going on all year. And that's quite clear. And as a result, a lot of the banks have actually stepped back and gone, well, we'll do the things we can do. It's become a bit of a regulatory and a compliance thing rather than anything else. So, we will comply with whatever the Basel IV likely regulations are going to be on climate. There's 3.1's got some bits in it, but we will comply with all of that, and we will make sure that we don't over comply, so we're not over promising, because otherwise we'll get taken to the cleaners because of greenwashing. So from a private sector point of view, there's been this whole move away from it, and there really has been a nervousness. Everybody is waiting to see what the regulators will do. So from a UK government point of view, what do you do with that? You've got to hit net zero targets by 2050, and the government is committed to that. That actually from a security perspective, you've got to do something. And David Lammy was last week saying that the security angle to foreign policy from climate change is really significant. Look at what's happening with migration. We're going to see more of that. If you look at 70% of the migration from the Horn of Africa, for example, is climate related because of droughts and flooding. So we've got to do something. It will affect British foreign policy, Britain's position in the world, Britain's economy. We have to do something. Everybody does. So this climate fund will be targeted at the things we can do, and it will be targeted at, it will be linked with the critical mineral strategy, so developing our own. We're actually about the 10th largest lithium exporter in the world. Nobody ever, but then China controls 90% of lithium, so it's tiny. But we do have in Cornwall that capacity. So there will be a lot of talk around opportunities for investment in that sector. There will be a lot of talk about technologies. You've got the Green Fund, the Climate Fund will have a lot focused on the green technologies that are going to be in there. And I think combined with the various other things, which is actually those national infrastructure funds, climate and the National Wealth Fund, are going to have UK Export Finance and the British Business Bank reporting into them. So they're going to tidy up that whole framework of public guarantees to critical infrastructure. That will make things easier. So you're going to see more co-investment coming from the British Business Bank, from the various funds, so that there are more opportunities out there to do things that are meaningful. I think it's a huge area.
And you mentioned it's a relatively small gun for a relatively big elephant. Do you think it's enough to make the kind of difference that's required, or will we see more, or is this a distraction?
Is it a distraction? It's very tempting with every government to go, they're just paying lip service to it. Remember what I said at the beginning, which is this government is really constrained in terms of what it does next. I think it's a signal that the government is positive about the need to do something and is putting in place not just a fund, but harmonising all of the other government funds. You think about it, there's already a National Infrastructure Fund, Green Infrastructure Fund, there's already a British Business Bank, there's already a business growth fund. There's already, what they're doing is they're pulling all of these things together to make them all talk to each other, so that the sum of the amount of money will be greater than the 8 billion. And it's laying down a foundation to say this has to be for the long term, and this is why the rhetoric in Liverpool this week is so important. This long-term prospect of government, because this government has a majority for the next 4 or 5 years. It's got some stability there. So in a way, at the beginning, it can say nothing at all and do things that look like they're tweaking with a view to getting that growth and then investing more. And I believe that will be the principle of what they want to do.
One of the issues that seems to have been floating around since long before this government, and as an economy we're struggling to overcome it, is productivity, and just it's stuck and has been for a long time. Yeah. Interested in your thoughts both on why you think it's such a difficult issue to resolve. It's not a fire alarm, but the building might be falling down. Why it's such a difficult issue to resolve, but also, is there anything in what we'll see from this government that might address that?
So you're going to hear, please forgive me, I'm going to sound like an economist now for 5 seconds. You're going to hear a lot about gross value added. Now, what's gross value added? Gross value added is every single time you have something in a production cycle, it adds a little bit more value. So if you're pulling stuff out the ground, its base thing, then you've got to turn it into something. So you calculate the delta, if you like, the difference. That's the value added. And you keep doing that through the economy. We're going to see a lot of conversation about that, because that value added and performing at the higher end of the value chain is where you get the higher productivity. Now, that's all well and good. That's the theory behind it all. The government in its economic talks will talk about value added, gross value added, how we're going to justify that expenditure in terms of gross value added that it creates. That's all about productivity. It's all about visibly doing something with the macroeconomic framework of the economy to make it look like we're improving things. The base problem of the UK economy is that actually we've had a productivity gap with Europe and America since 1900. I remember when I was doing my PhD all those moons ago, and a professor who's very eminent in this field of productivity and innovation stood up and he drew this line and he said, well, basically, if you look over a long period of time, we've seen productivity growth is zero. Because you get a huge increase in productivity when you get new technology introduced, then it falls back again. Then you get another increase in technology, then it falls back again. So productivity actually does this, but if you look over a couple of 100 years, the effect is zero. You're just getting richer in money terms rather than real terms. Which means that if you've got a productivity gap, say with the United States or with Europe, that productivity gap is always there unless you make a fundamental shift in the way you educate, the way you train, the way you manage your finances, the way you manage your science and innovation. That's been the problem that Gordon Brown actually tried to fix back in the last Labour government. That's why he was seen as such a micromanager, why he had science policies that lasted 10, 15 years. I haven't seen anything yet in the government's policies yet that say that they're going to invest for the long term and that they're taking this was called very snappily, this type of economic approach was called endogenous growth theory. That I have seen no sign that there's going to be any return to that, but they have talked about skills, and they've suddenly realised that universities are a bit of a challenge. So, but why we like it, fundamental underinvestment, and it's over donkey's years. It's not just recent. A fundamental underinvestment over a very long period of time. Back to the point at the beginning, that's why they need industrial strategy.
You've mentioned the importance of America a few times today already, which will be lost on none of us, I'm sure, but in terms of waiting to see what administration we have over in America and the Inflation Reduction Act, etc., can you tell us a bit about what you expect the foreign policy of this government to be, and in particular what that means for business? So
this government's foreign policy, they've already said it's going to be focused in the first instance on climate, which is interesting because they're talking about climate security and how climate actually affects our security and therefore our relations with other countries. That actually rhetorically pulls us closer to Europe again rather than to the United States, because foreign policy in the United States is very traditional. It's sort of America's policeman role in the rest of the world. Now, I think in terms of foreign policy, we will also see us coming closer to Europe. Full stop. It won't be to undermine what's happened with Brexit. It will be through the back door. We'll be bringing ourselves closer. There won't be trade deals. So foreign policy and trade policy, insofar as they intersect, is not going to be driven around trade deals. We're not going to be running around like we were 5 years ago, trying to get more trade deals. Sorry, we've already got one with Vanuatu, we've already got one with St Kitts and Nevis and the Marshall Islands. We've got all of those important ones under our belt, and the United States is not and has not for the last 5 years been talking about trade deals at all. So the current administration, the Biden administration, hasn't talked about trade deals. The deals that the United States does now are strategic ones to secure critical minerals and supply chains. They're not to create free trade. And if President Trump comes in, there's an even lower likelihood. There's more likely to be a more aggressive attitude towards trade. We're going to develop closer relationships in the UK with countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and India. And that's actually really important because, number one, it offers us big investment opportunities because we're going to see those markets becoming more accessible. But why are we going with those countries and not focusing on America? It's because those countries actually at the moment, in the wake of Russia, Ukraine, hold a huge amount of strategic power. They are the ones that are making the decisions around sanctions implementation and export controls and limitations. So an awful lot of trade is being diverted around through those countries. We're one of the largest oil importers, from India. Why? Because we need refined oil, and we had Russian oil. We're not importing from Russia, but Russian oil is going into India as crude oil. It's being refined and then it's coming to the UK. So it gives countries like India a huge amount of political power. That redistribution of supply chains means that in international relations, they call it the middling powers. I think that's patronising. They're not middling powers. They are powers like everybody else, and they have a lot of sway. So we are going to be coming closer to India, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular. There are a number of problematic countries like Kazakhstan and in the sort of Central Asian area of influence where we're going to have to be very careful because they have a lot of critical minerals as well. So in terms of our economic policy, our supply chain policy and our foreign policy, they're all going to be very closely interrelated with one another, and they'll have to be.
I understand you also feel America's relationship with us and attitude towards China is going to be key to our trade future. Say a bit more about that.
So I mean, America's, do I want to call it interesting? Interesting not in a good way at the moment, because and there are people who say America has become inward looking and is trying to disconnect itself from the global economic system. America cannot disconnect itself from the global economic system because, as you all know, dollar determines what goes on in exchange markets. It's really important in international trade. Around 53% of international trade is done in the US dollar, and it's incredibly important. It is the lifeblood of the global economy. But the problem with America is that it's doubting its own role, and neither Kamala Harris nor Biden nor Donald Trump doesn't want to, but the Democrats haven't been able to convince middle America that America needs to have that global policeman role. It's a very European perspective that we need America to have that global policeman role. So whatever happens after the American election, America will loosen its hold on NATO, I suspect. I mean, if Trump wins, then America quite possibly will say, right, until Europe is spending X percent of its 2% of its GDP or more on its own defence, we're not going to get involved. And I would say Trump will find it quite difficult to unravel the whole of the NATO post-war infrastructure, but Donald Trump's unravelled the World Trade Organization. He's made the United Nations, you know, the things that he did with the World Trade Organization have de facto meant that it can't arbitrate anymore in trade disputes. So America has a huge amount of influence, and a lot of these things are going to come through trade, because NATO is now acutely aware of the fact that trade is being used against Russia to limit Russia's access to resources. So we are going to have to get closer to Europe. We're going to have to get closer to Europe in terms of defence and security, in terms of expenditure, and then in terms of trade, energy dependency. And whoever wins the election in America is going to find it difficult to get through Congress decisions to increase their budget, because America already has a colossal budget deficit. If Trump comes in, he will be running his economics on the basis of this zero sum. We have a huge trade deficit with China and the rest of the world. That weakens us. I export more, you export less, I win, you lose. It's very zero-sum thinking. He will be wanting more of that. He's going to slap tariffs on everybody, particularly China. And that's going to influence how we can work with China, because the US regulatory system, if it goes into US regulations, and you've seen this with cars this week, you know, some cars that have dashboards which are based on Chinese or Russian technology, you know, America's talking about them being banned. This has huge consequences for Europe, but for the UK as well, in terms of our relationship with BYD, the Chinese electric car manufacturer, for example, where we're bringing in sponsorship, where we're bringing in technologies. You look at the European Championships, football championships this summer. They were sponsored by Alipay and BYD. Huge influence that China has absolutely everywhere. And whatever happens after the next election, both Trump and Harris have a negative approach towards China. And that means unpicking all of our global supply chains, huge economic consequences, and potentially inflationary as well.
I feel much better about all of it.
Oh, good, I'm glad you feel better. Look, you never ask an economist to come and chat if you want to end up feeling cheerful. It's just not one of those things that happens, right?
I'm having a dinner party in a fortnight.
I never get asked to dinner parties. I wonder why. I'll tell you a funny story. I was once doing a talk. I had 25 people, all men, around a table with a client, and I'd been talking about this, that and the other, and they were all having a few glasses of wine, and one of them said, to the bloke sitting next to me, "How come you're sitting next to the only woman in the room?" And I said, "He's probably thinking to himself, how come I'm sitting next to the only economist in the room?"
There's an awful lot that we've covered in the first sort of 40 minutes or so. As an investment community and as investors, what do you think that means for us? What should we be weighing up? Where are the opportunities?
Right, so now I'm going to go glass half full, okay? So because I'm an optimistic economist is sort of a contradiction in terms, but I think there are huge opportunities. You just need to understand where your risk appetite is and understand what is happening in these key markets, not just in the UK, but globally. So despite all of the sort of, well, I'll use your word again because I like it, mercurial approach to ESG, I still think that particular sectors in sustainability have a huge amount of potential. So I think things around climate technologies, I think even things that are around social technologies as well, I think they have a huge potential still, and we haven't even tapped into, you know, it's beyond wind farms, it's beyond critical minerals, it's actually how we're creating systems integrators between those types of things. So I think sustainability is a huge area that you know, really, everybody just used sustainability as a catchphrase. We need to start unpicking that. If we're going to change the planet, then we have to understand exactly what we mean. And from a financial point of view, understanding what your social and environmental returns are on an investment is becoming a regulatory requirement. So that's an exciting thing to do. Right, okay, so now we have to do this for regulatory reasons. Where are the opportunities? And that's exciting. I think, on the flip side of that, I think Russia-Ukraine has completely altered the way in which we think about defence and security. There's increasing numbers of investment opportunities in security and defence, and those will be in Europe because, as I've said, Europe will be needing to spend more on defence. And at the moment, there are a lot of American private equity companies coming in and investing in that defence space and actually almost undermining European supply chains despite the fact they want to withdraw from NATO. There's an opportunity there. And the language has changed. So the language of with investors around defence and security, where it used to be a huge compliance no-no, is now, okay, well, it's an industry and maybe we're fighting a just war in Ukraine, and maybe that means that we need to think again about what defence is and where it sits in our whole investment portfolio. So that's an opportunity. And I think those two things actually for me at the moment are the biggest areas where there's a lot happening and a lot being decided on. So watching what's possible in those markets is huge. I think AI is a bit one of those where I'd say still hold back a little bit because there's a lot of regulatory frameworks and things, and I'm not really saying anything that other people aren't saying until we know exactly how AI is going to be useful and how disruptive it is. And it is disruptive, don't get me wrong, but how ultimately this hubris settles down into its use as a tool. I think there are risks in terms of investing in that, and there are huge opportunities in terms of semiconductor technologies and those types of things. In that now that we're moving away from China, there are going to be investment opportunities around that, and UK lithium, why not?
And thinking about geographies and where we invest, that the UK markets have kind of gone sideways for an extended period of time. Do you expect to see that unlock? Do you expect to see any real movement there?
So the Labour government has said it will reassure markets that UK financial markets are open for business. The UK financial system is huge, biggest, second biggest in the world. It's still a major financial centre. But UK markets themselves have become less interesting because of the volumes that have gone elsewhere. So, if you look at trade volumes, they've gone to Europe, they've gone to Amsterdam, and they've gone to Frankfurt, and they've gone to Paris to some extent. There's a lot of high-tech, really fast-growing investments that have gone onto the NASDAQ. And so capital movements around this sort of sense that we haven't got a services agreement or financial services agreement with Europe. There's still a lot of uncertainty about where the long-term effects of Brexit are on UK financial markets, and I think that is having an impact on the volumes and the liquidity in those markets. Also got some very old tech type, commodity type things on UK markets which aren't necessarily as interesting. Big question at the moment, anybody who's listening to the radio, but it's this morning, but it's been brewing for a while. What happens if the Shine clothing company lists on the London Stock Exchange? That's suggesting that the London Stock Exchange has a slightly different purpose to everything else. So what the Labour Party is going to have to do is think about the regulations, think about making a regulatory framework that's attractive. The PRA has already Prudential Regulatory Authority has already come out with its interpretations of the Basel 3.1 regulations, and I think a lot of that's going to be really important in re-triggering interest in UK markets and UK growth opportunities, because the problem we have at the moment, which is affecting our trade finance position, it's affecting all of our banks in those markets, is that Basel 3.1 is going to militate against our integration with our smaller companies into global supply chains. It's going to have a huge effect because the liquidity requirements are so high. And there was legislation under the last government which needs to be unpicked that actually biased against smaller companies requiring high liquidity ratios as well. So that business, so I think where the government can reassure those markets, it's by not gold plating regulations that are out there around sustainability and around KYC and know your clients and anti-money laundering, but actually trying to unpick some of the regulations that are coming from global regulators so that they don't damage our mid-tier companies and our mid-caps.
I'm going to hand over to the audience for questions in just one moment, but just a final one from me. Any final thoughts you'd like us to take away that perhaps we haven't covered already?
So I guess if there is a final thought, it's risk management and constant change and insecurity are endemic to the economic system. You know, now there's a much faster pace of change because of digital, which makes everything seem negative and risky. But it's only business as usual, maybe business as unusual, because you know, we've been dealing with change, rapid change, technological change. That's what markets deal with. So there are opportunities out there. Be patient with the Labour government, because I think it's just going to be boring. I just think it's going to be very, very technocratic. I think there are opportunities out there, and a lot depends on how you manage and how you manage those opportunities and what your risk appetite is.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Hi, Rebecca. Do you think that when they bring some of these tax changes in, that there's a danger that they make some of them retrospective? For example, the Resident tax changes and offshore trusts. And do you think that's going to, if they do that, how damaging could that be to UK PLC?
I think there's a risk. I think they're prepared to take that risk, actually. I think a lot of the retrospective treatment of wealth in this country, they've decided that's one they'll take for the team a little bit, because I think they feel that it's more important to keep the voting public along with them. And I think it could be very damaging indeed in terms of the numbers of people, high net worth people, and therefore the numbers of people who are around to invest in UK businesses, etc., startups and things like that. I think it could be very damaging. I think that kind of shift in the sort of what's the word I'm looking for, social approach to the UK economy is going to be very different. You'll hear lots of people, I mean, John McDonnell this morning saying listening to Rachel Reeves was like listening to George Osborne, and you know, I mean, that may or may not be the case, that the strictures around public expenditure are going to stay very similar. What's going to happen is at the margins, which is, you know, not the thing that Joe on the Clapham omnibus is going to be thinking about necessarily, but at that very wealthy end of the market, I think we are likely to see some capital flight. I think we're already seeing it to some extent, and that has an interesting effect on the reputation of London as a financial centre, because you are not then presenting London as a place that will welcome everybody. And we've always been, and this was one of the things that actually the Blair government did well, was to make us cool Britannia. You want to be in London because you want to be in London. London's a place, right? And I think it's lost its gloss a little bit anyway. And I think the Labour government has to tread very carefully in that space. I really do. And I think it will have to do down the line, if it does retrospectively impose penalties and taxes and so on, I think it will have to be very, very careful in terms of what it does in the future to bring that money back. It's better not to lose it in the first place.
Hi there, yeah. Obviously a lot of the commentary on the budget is all around personal tax and capital gains. Do you think we'll see any major or any changes for corporates, or how corporates are taxed? I mean, I'm thinking around, you already mentioned that FTSE 100 is a really old market. Net zero targets, you know, how are we going to be cool Britannia again? It must start with companies as well as individuals. I
think it's something that the government hasn't really thought about. I mean, at the moment, the main thinking around corporation tax has been around national insurance, and I think I mean, speaking as having been a small business owner and running my own company now, I would say there are a lot of penalties on those smaller businesses, tiny businesses that actually are the lifeblood of this economy. And actually running a smaller business like that is very, very difficult under the tax regimes as they are right now. So making things worse and altering, for example, employers' national insurance taxation could be very significant. I don't think they'll do anything to the headlines. I think that's important because they still want to be seen as a low tax type place. But I think they are going to do, because if they're coming back in line with the European Union, a lot of the things about VAT treatment and so on, and where your organisation is headquartered, those things are going to be significant. So I think it's hard to say because nothing explicit. I mean, they've managed to leak all their stuff about clothing allowances and things like that, but they're not leaking stuff around what they're thinking is around corporate taxation terribly well, so that we can understand a little bit more about what's going on. And that, I think, is probably an existential question, because I think if they're going to create growth, it has to be through the mid-caps, it has to be through the smaller entities, and it has to be through, they've talked about a national wealth fund, but they haven't, but they've also talked, and apparently now they've said no, but a national wealth tax as well. And, we can't take and take and take and take from the organisations that are actually putting something back into the UK economy. And I think really that's where it's a conundrum that they're going to have to sort out, and maybe it'll be through industrial policy. So they'll take corporation tax with one hand and give it back in terms of incentives to be investing in other areas. And I'm afraid Cool Britannia is not coming back, because love him or loathe him, Keir Starmer's not cool. I mean, he's a technocrat. He's a Mario Draghi. He's going to do what he sees as the right thing. Rachel Reeves is going to do the same thing, but a Tony Blair, Cool Britannia, we all want to be here because we want to be here. It's not coming back anytime soon, I'm afraid. We want some fun back in London, don't we, really?
We've got time for just one more. Go ahead.
I was saying, under the Conservatives, obviously, where the pension changes and things and reforms happen, they always put in protection of things for existing individuals. Do you think when changes are made, they'll still have some form of protection for people, so it'll be more impacting new contributions or things in the future, or do you think it will just be...
No, I think they'll have to put in protections. I think they will have to, because Keir Starmer's a lawyer. And this is going to be a very legalistic... We have a contract, so you have a social contract with your government when you vote them in, for them to do the things that you have technically voted for. The social contract with this government is that they're not the Tories, and that they're going to stabilise the ship. Okay, that's basically what we voted for. So then he will say, but where are the contracts that UK PLC workers, us general people have with the government? Well, it'll be around existing pension structures, and it'll be around existing investment structures and so on. So the things will be tapered. They will come in gradually over time. That has to happen. They may be able to go back to a point in time with nom-doms. They may be able to do things that have, because they've trailed it and because we knew what was going to happen, but they won't be able to change, let's say, inheritance tax thresholds or anything like that immediately with retrospective effect, because that actually, I think I'm right in saying that wouldn't be legal. I mean, you've got to make sure that what you've invested in when you were investing in it is still the thing. I mean, it's one of the reasons why there are still final salary pension schemes and things like that around. It's because when somebody comes into the workforce, you agree your terms and conditions. You can't then renege on that contract. So I think it would be very difficult for them to do that. But he's a lawyer. Who knows?
Have they not gone that with state pension? With changing the age? You say a contract with the government.
this is one of the reasons why a lot of women in particular have been very unhappy around what's changed with state pensions, because they didn't pay into national insurance either, which is why I'm caveating it with he's a lawyer who knows, because the problem with law is that it's always a function of policy and politics. I would be very cautious in doing anything until we know what comes in the budget, because I think there are so many things so many known unknowns at the moment. However, I might be making sure that my capital gains tax and inheritance tax before the budget, I might be making sure that those positions are quite clear, and that I've minimised on the basis of the current framework, because I think it's going to get worse after the budget. I would put my neck out and my head up above the parapet and say that's going to happen. I'm fairly certain you can change labour law, but you can't change investment law, I don't think.
Sorry, when you say it's going to change post-budget, do you mean gradually or?
The changes can change from the next day. They can change from 1st of November, but it's more likely that it will take, I mean, inheritance tax, he'll probably want to do it within a fiscal year, so it will probably be for the next fiscal year, because they have to give you time to adapt and so on. But I mean, I can't say because I don't know. I mean, I'm one of these economists who will actually say I don't know, and I think at the moment the problem is that the government is trying to find out itself. I mean, until the budget is actually announced and until we know exactly what those things are going to be, it's going to be quite difficult to make decisions. But I would be looking to change things around right now, because they will come in quickly, to hedge it. Yeah.
That is time. I'm sorry. We will try and pick up questions and get some answers to those later. Firstly, thank you very much, Rebecca.
Our next speaker is John Woolley, again someone I'm sure many of you have heard of before, but so as not to butcher his biography as well. John Woolley is a director of Wooltech Limited, having previously been a director of Technical Connection Limited for 25 years. John is a qualified barrister, a fellow of the Chartered Insurance Institute and a member of the Chartered Institute of Taxation. He's been involved in financial planning in the financial services sector for the last 30 years. So without further ado, John, over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. Good morning, everybody. Get a fantastic view here of London Bridge Station. I've got fond memories of London Bridge because years ago I lost some sunglasses on a train. So I went to the Lost Property Office at London Bridge, and it's amazing what you see in there. There was handbags, there was gloves, other spectacles, and there was also a headstone. And I always remember this, because on the headstone it had "never forgotten." So there you go. True story. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the 22 billion black hole and how that black hole is going to be filled. So what we'll be looking at here is basically a background to Labour's first budget, which is up and coming obviously at the end of October. We'll be looking at some of the changes that may take place, which some of them have been quite heavily flagged or anticipated in the press. And I'll be looking at appropriate planning for clients in the run-up to the budget, and a little bit about what they might consider after the budget. So we've got the budget on the 30th of October. We've got a long lead-in time to that, which is very unusual, and it's created a bit of speculation, and it's caused a lot of clients to embark on some quite big planning in advance of that. More about that in a moment. The background is really the fact that obviously if we go back to July, this was Labour's first victory for a long time, so they came to power. They hadn't really said very much about their tax policy in their manifesto. You may recall they were pressed quite a bit on this, but they managed to stay fairly quiet about it. They did make a commitment not to increase the taxes of working people, and Rebecca's already mentioned that. I'll come back to that in a second. What's also happened, though, is that they've got to raise money to pay for public services, perhaps repay a bit of the national debt unless they borrow for growth, and obviously fund some of these pay awards in the public sector. Since they've actually come to power, they've discovered this black hole, this supposedly black hole of 22 billion, And so there's been a lot of focus on how that is going to be repaid. I looked at this. A black hole is something which sucks in everything around it. It's got a massive gravitational force. Nothing gets out. It's a bit like paying your tax to the revenue and then trying to get a tax refund. Nothing comes back, at least for a long time. In terms of dealing with this black hole problem, Keir Starmer has made this statement. You remember the Rose Garden at number 10 at back end of August, where he said things will get worse before they get better. Those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burden. So what does this mean? There's a little bit of panic that goes around the country. Are we going back to the days of Dennis Healey? Now, I can remember Dennis Healey in the 1978 budget, and he said there, we're going to tax you until the pips squeak. And what that sort of meant then, seriously, was 83% top rate income tax and a 15% investment income surcharge. So if you're a high earner and you had investment income over 5,000, you paid marginal 98%. Well, I don't think we're quite facing that, but what we are facing is clearly the likelihood of some serious tax increases. And that's what's causing the apprehension, and it's causing a lot of clients to take planning action. Now, I think a good analogy of the situation we've got now is Donald Rumsfeld when he said there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Okay? So what do we expect in the budget? Well, I think the known knowns are the pre-announced tax changes. We know some of these changes which are going to take place next year, so we can do some planning for that. The known unknowns are the changes that will be made to existing taxes like capital gains tax, pensions, inheritance tax. The unknown unknowns are really the things we don't know about. They're not taxes that exist at the moment, and they may be new taxes which come in. So it may be that Rachel's going to need her hard hat when she goes to the House of Commons for her budget delivery at the end of October, because she may be coming out with some quite nasty proposals. Let's have a look at first of all, the unknown unknowns. So what might happen there? Well, I'm just joking. We could have a beer tax. Henry VIII introduced a beer tax. That's easy to avoid, isn't it, when you think about it? We had a window tax for 150 years, referred to as daylight robbery, until that was closed down in 1851 because of health concerns. We're likely to get some sort of tax on plastic, and that's part of obviously the green campaign there. And there's also been talk about a wealth tax. Now that's been spoken about for a month or so, but it seems to be that the government are now going away from that. There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, a wealth tax, the wealth tax could be a one-off or it could be an annual tax, which applies a percentage tax charge to asset values over a certain figure. Now, for some people, they're asset rich and income poor, so it would be unfair for them to suffer that wealth tax. It's also difficult to administer because you need valuations on assets and so forth, and that can lead to disputes. It can be avoidable by transferring wealth on, or even moving outside the country. And the experiences of other countries that have introduced a wealth tax has been bad. So, for example, Spain introduced a wealth tax a couple of years ago, and they raised only 632 million euros in that year. That sounds a lot to me, but in the overall scheme of things, that's not very much. So it would seem the current thinking is that we won't get the introduction of a wealth tax. Let's look at some of the known knowns. So here we're looking at stuff that has already been announced and will be introduced. So we know about the winter fuel allowance. Bit of speculation pre-Labour conference that there might be a U-turn on that, but that's not going to take place now. We know that. VAT on private schools, we know that's coming in from the 1st of January 2025, and there's measures going to be introduced to prevent forestalling, so people paying in advance now for fees that are due next year. There is a legal challenge being mounted against this particular new rule, and the idea there is to say that this is unfair because it punishes children or parents of children who are disabled who have got special needs and need private school education. Now they're going to have to pay a lot more, these particular families. So it's be interesting to see what happens there. You know, we were supposed to have a new social care system from October 2025. This is under Boris Johnson, where he was proposing a cap of £86,000 on the amount of money a person puts towards their care. Not the so-called hotel expenses, but their care. That's not going to happen. The 23,250 upper capital limit was going to go to 100,000. That's not going to happen. So we know that's in the pipeline. Furnished holiday lets will not be treated as a trade from the 6th of April next year. So we know that's going to happen. And of course, we've got these changes in the non-dom tax rules, which were originally proposed by the Conservative government and have been taken on board by Labour and potentially made more harsher. So let's just have a quick look at those, because a number of you may have non-dom clients. So the first thing to note there is from April next year, non-dom clients who've got overseas income and capital gains won't be able to use the remittance basis. So if they're UK resident, they pay tax on an arising basis on these overseas income and gains. There will be a 4-year foreign income and gains period in which new arrivals coming to the UK won't pay any tax on their foreign income and capital gains, provided they haven't been resident in the UK for at least 1 year in the last 10. So if they're genuine people who have come to the UK, then they'll get this 4-year FRAG relief. There's also going to be a special temporary repatriation facility whereby people who are non-DOMs who are suddenly caught by these new rules can bring in income and gains from previous years and bring them into the UK and have them taxed at a lower tax rate. This was something the Conservatives suggested for 2 years with a 50% tax charge. Labour have said, we're going to take that on, but it's going to be slightly different. The income of offshore trusts, where the settler is a potential beneficiary, will be subject to tax from the 6th of April 2025 if the settler is UK resident. Okay, that's quite nasty, because previously there was income tax and capital gains tax protection on these trusts. And one of the big one of the changes that is definitely going to take place is a switch in basis of inheritance tax. So currently it's on a domicile basis. It's going to switch onto a residence basis. So it's not where you're domiciled, it's whether you've been resident in the UK for the last 10 years. If you are, you're potentially subject to inheritance tax on all of your assets worldwide. That's in the UK and your foreign assets as well, subject to double taxation agreement. And that's obviously tipped the balance for Charlie Mullins, Pimlico Plumbers, who had a flat over there, I think. Yeah, he had a lovely view of the Shard. He's off now. He's had enough of this. He's going to try and live abroad from 10 years and be outside of UK inheritance tax. So planning for non-UK domiciliaries, the first thing is if you've got a client who is a non-dom and he's got overseas property, that is excluded property, make a gift of it now, because it's going to be taxed under the current rules. Offshore bonds are suddenly going to become very attractive because they roll up income and capital gains. So you don't get taxed on an arising basis. So I'd imagine some of the offshore life officers are rubbing their hands looking at this. A number of non-dom clients will have excluded property trusts, which are trusts they've set up which hold offshore property. That means that if they set the trust up when they're a non-dom, it's outside the inheritance tax net forever, even if the settler is a beneficiary under the trust. The Conservative government said we would give protection to these for trusts set up before the 6th of April 2025. Labour have said they won't give that protection. They'll tax these trusts. Now, of course, if you've got a settler who's a beneficiary under a trust and it's no longer excluded property, you've got a gift with reservation of benefit. So the big question for clients who have got these trusts is whether they release their interest before the 6th of April 2025. And we won't know the full details of this until we see the papers which are released as part of the budget. Right, so now we move on to the unknown knowns. And I'm suggesting here that these are changes to taxes we already know about. We just don't know what the changes will be. So what evidence have we got for the likelihood of certain changes? Well, Labour have said they won't introduce changes that impact on the working person. We assume that to mean income tax, national insurance and VAT, as Rebecca said earlier. The issue is, has that position changed since the discovery of the 22 billion black hole? Because this statement was made some time ago. I don't know. Could NIC rates stay the same, but the bands change? Could there be a hike on employers' NIC? That could be possible. Or the other thing I think is very possible is a continued freezing of income tax rates and personal allowances. Sorry, that figure there says 26-27. It's frozen actually to 27-28. Because this is a very easy way of raising billions of pounds of tax, as the Conservative Party have seen when they were in government. So you extend that by a couple of years and you're probably looking at 15 billion in tax. So many more people, because of these stealth provisions, are now high rate taxpayers. So the main Labour targets here, I think the ones that we've identified and the ones which there is speculation about in the press, are capital gains tax, inheritance tax, pensions and property. And so anybody who is potentially affected by these likely changes should think about taking action now. And the type of person I'm thinking about is a person who's been perhaps sitting on the fence for the last year or so. Because we've had mixed political messages, haven't we? Conservatives saying we might abolish inheritance tax. Then Labour come in and it's likely to get worse. So those people haven't done their planning, and it's a good time to consider it now. So if they've been considering taking action, perhaps bring that forward. And to a lot of people, they won't be worse off by taking that action because they were considering it anyway. So they won't be worse off, I think, if the rules change. It's very unlikely for any changes to be retrospective. Of course, with inheritance tax, you look at the inheritance tax rules at the date of death, yeah? Bit different from income tax and capital gains tax, remember that. So any change now, you look at what happens when the person dies and then test it against the rules. But I certainly feel that clients who will be affected or likely to be affected should not prevaricate. They might lose an opportunity. I actually joined a prevarication society last month, but we haven't arranged a meeting yet. Right, I'm just going to get a drink of water. So moving on, let's first of all look at capital gains tax and what could be the situation there. Well, as Rebecca said, the Treasury collected £15 billion in 2022-23. A bit of a drop in the ocean compared to income tax, obviously, but it is expected to increase, and the Office of Budget Responsibility think it will reach 23.5 billion in 5 years' time. The current rates of CGT for individuals are 10% if the gain takes them into basic rate, 20% if it takes them into higher or additional rate tax bands. So it's quite simple, 10, 20%. If it's residential property, it's 18 and 24%. You know, that came down in the last budget to try and encourage people to sell second properties and free up the property market. If you're selling a business, you get entrepreneurs relief, or it's called business asset disposal relief now. So the first £1 million of gains are taxed at 10%. Any excess is subject to the marginal rates of capital gains tax. CGT exemption was helpfully reduced from 12,300 2 years ago to 3,000 now. That's like a 75% reduction, massive reduction in the CGT exemption, which has caused more people to drop into CGT, I'm sure. And there are evidence that people are selling shares now, and they're selling second properties. A lot of buy-to-let investors have had enough. This is the final nail in the coffin, you know, and they're selling. So what's happening here is the Treasury are getting a load more CGT receipts without any change in the law, when you think about it. Because people are precipitating capital gains now to pay tax at a lower rate before any change comes in. So this is good news for Labour because they'll see these receipts go up substantially. What are the possible changes? Well, I think there's three there. The first is a hike in the tax rates, and they've spoken about aligning the rate of capital gains tax with the rate of income tax a person pays. So it'd be 20, 40 or 45%, or perhaps a flat rate of 30%. The next area they might look at is changing that rule which revalues assets for CGT purposes when somebody dies. We all know that little saying, death is a good form of CGT planning, because you revalue the asset at that time, even if the asset passes to a spouse or it's business assets, so you don't pay inheritance tax. Now, I think it's quite likely there'll be a change in that. That's worth £1.5 billion, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So we may well get a change there. And I think we'll get a change to the carried interest regime. This is for people who run private equity funds, manage them, and any profit they receive is currently taxed to CGT at 28%. And the issue is, why isn't it subject to income tax? So I think we'll see a change there. The impact of these tax increases, this is an at-worst position. So let's say somebody's making a capital gain at the moment on shares in an investment of £50,000. If they're an additional rate taxpayer, they'll currently pay CGT of £9,400. That's 20% of 47,000. That's the 50,000 gain less the 3,000 annual exemption. If CGT went up to a top rate of 45%, that liability would go to 21,150. That's an increase of 11,750. That's a significant increase. So that's the at-worst position. The justification for the increase is, why should capital profits suffer a lower rate of tax and income? And also, people investing for capital growth rather than income distorts the investment markets. The arguments against this are, first of all, if you put up rates of CGT, will revenues increase? You've all heard of the Laffer curve, and the impact of increasing tax rates doesn't necessarily mean more revenue to the government. It's because what happens is people's behaviour changes. So you might think, rather than selling that investment, I'll wait for the next government when CGT rates go down, or I might die and my children inherit it, and we'll get a revaluation for CGT purposes. So a lot of people think that if you hike CGT rates to income tax rates, you won't get an increase in revenue. So it's probably more likely, I think, that you get a CGT rate of about 30% rather than alignment with income tax rates. People might invest inside corporate structures to avoid CGT at high individual rates. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Can increased rates be justified? Well, the government can do what they like, but a lot of people invest out of after-tax income, don't they? So they've already paid tax once. Should they pay tax again? And will a rate increase mean that we have to introduce stuff like taper relief or indexation relief for periods of high inflation, which would further complicate things? Probably not, but it's certainly something that should be thought about. One of the impacts on a rate increase could be on investment management strategies as well, because although collectives inside collectives which hold investments inside the wrapper there, they're not subject to CGT. So OICs, unit trusts holding shares, it's all CGT free. But of course, when the client sells units or shares, there could be CGT at that time. And of course, there's a couple of strategies that as advisors we adopt. For example, sometimes we in cash collectives, don't we, to fund an ISA. Well, if you go with your annual exemption and rates of CGT go up, you're looking at higher rates of tax at that time. Also, if you've got a situation where you've got rebalancing strategies on an investment fund, where you're changing asset profiles, and that's giving rise to gains, if CGT rates go up, those gains can be taxable at a higher rate on the client. So all of this needs to be thought about. Right, the impact going forward of increased CGT rates, well, EIS reinvestment relief becomes more valuable, doesn't it? Because you're deferring the capital gain, but you don't know what regime you're deferring it into. There's going to be more emphasis on independent taxation planning for husbands and wives. So if you've got a 45% taxpayer and a 20% taxpayer, a transfer an asset from the 45 to the 20 pre-disposal could save CGT at 25%. Losses become more valuable because if you've got losses you can carry forward, you can set them off against capital gains which are now subject to a higher rate of tax. Remember, you've got different treatment for carried forward losses and same year losses. So same year losses will completely wipe out the capital gain. Carry forward, you only have to use so much of the carry forward that preserves your annual exemption. It's more important that everyone in a family uses their 3,000 annual exemption, including children. You can use pension contributions to reduce your marginal rate of tax. That can save tax on capital gains, but we'll have to see what happens with the pension regime changes. ISAs and SIPs become massively more attractive, don't they? Because they're completely tax-free. VCTs become very attractive because of the tax freedom there, no CGT on exit, provided you haven't exceeded the £200,000 going in. And I think as the CGT benefits of collectives are eroded, single premium bonds become more attractive, particularly if you're investing for high yielding income within the funds, because there's no internal tax there, yet on a UK bond, the investor gets a 20% credit on the charge of event gain. Right, so what pre-budget planning can we look at in the context of capital gains tax? Well, I think if it's commercially expedient and your investments have done pretty well and you're a high rate taxpayer, you might as well, I think, take a capital gain now and pay tax at 20% if you're worried about tax rates going up. Okay? I've done that. I've been doing that for the last 6 months. There you go. Make disposals to realise capital losses, because if you've got losses that you can carry forward, you can set them off against gains subject to higher rates of tax. Make VCT investments if available. We don't know what will happen there, but they're very attractive for capital gains tax purposes and income tax. Maximise ISA and pension investments. Let's talk about a cap on ISA investments. This is quite a difficult one because it would mean how does that affect legitimate investor expectation? I put 20,000 in thinking it's all going to be tax free. Now you're imposing a cap. So if that happened, we might get a dual regime. But I think it would be, if clients haven't used their full £20,000 ISA exempt allowance, they should do it. And be cautious about claiming CGT holdover relief on gifts to discretionary trusts at the moment, because you could be holding over into a higher tax regime. A lot of clients may wish to sort of make a disposal but stay in the market. Remember, you've got this 30-day bed and breakfast rule. The way you can get around that is the 30-day bed and breakfast rule basically means that any disposal and reacquisition of the same investment in a 30-day period is neutral for CGT. That's basically what it means. So to get around that, you can do a bed and ISA. So you can sell the stock, the ISA buys it back. Bed and SIP, you sell, the SIP buys back. Bed and spouse, get the spouse to buy it back. Or bed and something similar is you sell stock A and you buy stock B, which is a different stock, but is very similar in terms of its investment qualities. I would say avoid artificial schemes to generate a disposal now, whereby the client is still basically the beneficial interest. In other words, creating a trust, selling to a trust, and the client is a beneficiary under the trust. That would be a disposal. Client has still got control, and it may be the revenue would look at those quite closely. We've also got business asset disposal relief. Now, I mentioned this earlier. If you're selling business assets, up to £1 million of gain will be taxed at 10%. Speculation there that it might be further reduced. At the very least, anything over £1 million will now be taxed at the new marginal rate of CGT that's imposed. And that's causing a lot of people who are thinking about selling a business to bring their operation forward. Other people feel that business asset disposal relief may increase, or the band may increase to say 2 or 3 million as a bit of a sweetener to entrepreneurs. Because after all, Labour have said they're a party to increase growth in the economy. Right, let's have a little look at inheritance tax now. So inheritance tax is another area where there's been a lot of speculation about changes. Tax receipts going up the whole time, 7.5 billion last year, which was a record. The average IHT bill for an estate was £215,000 in 2021. Now it's only 4% of estates who pay inheritance tax. But for those who pay it, 200,000 is quite a lot of money. And it's money that they are prepared to think about planning to save. The reasons for that is obviously the growth in the value of investments and property over the last 10 years or so, and the fact we've got frozen nil rate bands. So both the normal standard nil rate band of 325,000 and the residential nil rate band of 175,000 have been frozen to 27, 28. So it's another obviously evidence of a fiscal drag here, that you've got a situation where values are going up but the allowances are staying where they are. So there's obviously more wealth is being subject to inheritance tax. What are the options for Labour? Well, I reckon there's 8 options. I'm just going to throw them out there at the moment and then do a little bit of analysis on them. First of all, reduce nil rate bands, abolish potentially exempt transfers, extend the 7-year accumulation period, increase rates of inheritance tax, rationalise exemptions, that's bring all the exemptions together into one exemption, extend inheritance tax to pension plan death benefits, restrict agricultural relief, and restrict business relief. Okay, business and agricultural property relief are worth £4.4 billion to the taxpayer. So they're quite big. So what are the options here for Labour? Well, let's look at the nil rate bands first of all. I think it's unlikely there'll be any change in the nil rate bands. I don't think they'll reduce in value for sure. But one thing to note is that the residence nil rate band is complicated. I don't know if any of you have looked at this and the downsizing provisions. If you sell a property and replace it with investments and you leave the investments to children, it's an absolute nightmare. And they say in the UK that only 6 people fully understand these tax provisions, and 5 of them are in mental institutions. So you could see, and you've got the £2 million cap and so forth. So it could be that that Labour Party, the Labour government, would think that this doesn't really help a lot of Labour voters, so why don't we get rid of it and slightly increase the standard nil rate band? I could see that as a possibility. They might also extend the period of freezing, which again is a nice way of earning a few £billion going forward. Second one, abolish pets. Well, pets do, to a degree, if you're being honest about it, help the really wealthy, don't they? You can make a gift of £1 million, live 7 years, and it's outside your estate. Now, most people can't afford to do that, but the very wealthy can. So, would the government look at abolishing pets? So every transfer would be a chargeable transfer. So as long as you don't go over your nil rate band, you're okay, which most people wouldn't. But the pets would really hit the very wealthy, as would extending the 7-year accumulation period to perhaps 10 years. This is something else that's been speculated. So you have to live for longer for that pet to drop out. The issue there is a little bit, how do you run this system if people have already made gifts? Do you have 7 years for gifts already made and 10 years for gifts going forward? I think that would be unworkable. Personally, I think they'd just apply the 10-year rule for all gifts that's ever been made. So that's a possibility. Increase rates of inheritance tax. If you increase the rate of inheritance tax to 45%, that would be worth £1 billion to the government. I think I could see them perhaps increasing that rate at a higher level of taxable estate. So if your taxable estate went over £1 million, you'd pay 45% to that rate. But that's theoretically, I think, possible and quite an easy one to bring in. Rationalise exemptions. Well, the Office of Tax Simplification about 5 years ago suggested that we get rid of the annual exemption, normal expenditure, small gifts, marriage, and just give £125,000 per annum exemption, simplification. So that it could well be something that they look at. Extending inheritance tax of pension plans, I'll talk about that in a second. Restrict agricultural relief. I could see a change here for people who are investing in agricultural relief. Not farmers, but for people in cities who buy agricultural property, let it out for agricultural purposes, they get 50% agricultural relief. So I could see that being reduced. And then we've got business relief, and we've got a wide range of what we call business property. We've got shares in private managed companies right through to AIM-listed companies. Now, there has been speculation about the AIM, and there could be some changes there, but I think one of the problems there is if you removed business property relief from shares in the AIM market, it would destabilise that market considerably. So I'm not sure that they would go that far on that. They might extend the period of ownership you need to get business property relief from, say, 2 to 5 years. They might even cap the amount of relief, so you can only have 1 million, because currently it's completely unlimited. But then, of course, how do you apply that to a small business that grows in value, that starts off being worth 50,000 and ends up being 5 million in 10 years' time? So these are very much the options. What I'd suggest, though, is pre-budget planning here. If clients are thinking about making gifts, bring those gifts forward, particularly if they're substantial gifts. There's no doubt about that, and a lot of people are doing that as part of parcel of CGT planning. They're selling properties, buy-to-lets, and gifting the proceeds on, taking a CGT hit and gifting the proceeds on. If you've got trusts, this is something a little bit outside of this, but we've had a lot of inquiries on this. We've got the old trust, pre-2006 trusts, which are the old flexible power of appointment trusts, where you can make appointments, and those appointments are pets, if they're absolute appointments. If there was a change in the pet rules, that wouldn't be the case. So it's worth going back and looking at trusts now to see if there's any changes that should be made pre-budget. If you're making a very, very big gift and you still want control, think about a family investment company, because you can get pet treatment on that. So you're looking at a £2 million gift there. Start to make gifts now and document it on a regular basis to establish that pattern for normal expenditure out of income exemption. And if you want to make a gift, but you're a bit nervous about your beneficiaries, your children, you don't know how they're going to turn out. I mean, here's my son he went to Thresher's Week at the University of Kent. He went on to work for the Inland Revenue. But in those sort of situations where you're not certain, trusts can work. So make those gifts into trusts. Obviously, with inheritance trusts and so forth, you can get income and access. So pre-budget planning for IHT, those are the main ones. Also, I think consider business relief investments now. The rules might change, but the rules might not change to existing investments. So if clients have been thinking about making a business relief investment, it might be worth bringing that forward to now. I mean, if they imposed a cap, it might not apply to investments made pre-budget. There are obviously a few caveats about making an investment in a business relief scheme, and you'll all know about that. Obviously, there's no guarantees on the tax outcome, and some of these the underlying investments can be a little bit risky, so clients need to be aware of that. But they can be very appropriate for clients who don't think they're going to live for 7 years, so the normal gift doesn't work. Clients who, let's say, want to keep complete control over an asset, income and capital. And of course, clients who have sold a business and reinvest in this type of scheme within 5 years of sale, because the two periods of ownership then are rolled together for the 2-year ownership test. So again, investing now could well be a good idea if these clients have been sitting on the fence about making a business relief investment. And of course, a number of these schemes will enable you to encash the investment with very little charge if the rules go against you in the budget. It's my understanding, Huggy? Yeah? So the client hasn't really lost anything by doing that, particularly if he's been thinking about making that investment for a while. Right, quickly, I've only got about another 10 minutes, so we'll talk about pensions. And I think the options there for the government are to reintroduce the lifetime allowance, a restriction in tax relief on contributions, changes to the rules on tax-free cash, PCLS, and making death benefits subject to inheritance tax. I don't think we'll get a change in the lifetime allowance. Okay, we've now got these other two allowances, haven't we? The lump sum allowance and the lump sum death benefit allowance, which impose restrictions. The lifetime allowance has obviously gone, but Rachel Reeves has said there that she won't reimpose that. In fact, Labour would like to do a research into a review of the pensions tax legislation. Tax relief on contributions, well, currently clients get that at their marginal rate of tax. The cost to the government of higher rate tax is £30 billion, so this is low-hanging fruit. If you reduce the tax relief rate to basic rate, that would save the government £15 billion in tax, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So it could be that we're looking at some sort of restriction in the relief here to possibly a figure of 30%. There would be problems with introducing that because of the net pay arrangements which apply to people in defined benefit schemes, but I think the government would find a way around that. I'm sure they would, if they could see that they could make this tax grab. As I said a moment ago, the tax relief, the tax saving for the government, if you reduce relief to 30%, is £10 billion. That's bad for a higher rate taxpayer, but good, obviously, for a basic rate taxpayer. It wouldn't affect employer costs or public sector schemes. It wouldn't, if this happened, help people who are in that £100,000 plus trap, where they pay 60% effective income tax on income between 100 and 125,000. Because if this arrangement was introduced, the pension contribution would not reduce your adjusted net income. You'd pay the pension contribution and then you get a 30% credit from the government. And it would affect 6 million people, so it would have quite substantial effect. I think if this was introduced, the effective date of change would be budget day or the 6th of April 2025, but you could easily see there would be anti-forestalling rules if it was the 6th of April. The 6th of April is easier for the Treasury to administer, but of course they wouldn't want people packing loads of money into their pension schemes between budget day and the 6th of April. Other areas which may be looked at are salary sacrifice. That's worth £5 billion saving to the Treasury, a lot of money. And of course, certain salary sacrifice schemes were attacked a few years ago. Or we could get a reduction in the annual allowance, possibly 20,000 I've read somewhere, but that would have a huge impact on the NHS. And we go back to where we were, I think, probably 3 years ago. Other questions about reducing tax relief on contributions is, how does that impact on Labour's commitment to try to get people to save for their retirement and reduce the state burden? There's also been murmurings about the state old age pension as well. There was a question about this earlier, about perhaps putting back the date people benefit, perhaps means testing it, perhaps changing the triple lock situation after 2025. But of course, all those changes would be very unpopular. So I think with pensions planning at the moment, clients with unused allowances, clearly you've got a 60,000 allowance plus any carry forward of unused relief, have cash available, not earmarked for other purposes, and are higher rate taxpayers should pay sufficient now to utilise their higher rate tax relief, just in case there is a change in the budget. Hargreaves Lansdown report that there's been a 71% increase in people making £60,000 contributions over the last 2 months. So you can see this sort of action is being taken. PCLS entitlement, the lump sum allowance. Well, you know the maximum lump sum that you can take now in terms of tax-free cash is 268,275 or 25% of an elected amount, an elected LTA if higher. Many clients will be in this position where they've got a current entitlement to 268,275. There's virtually no chance of that increasing under Labour. So, what should they be thinking about? Well, it may be that as well as not increasing that amount, Labour may reduce the 25% to 20%. They could consider that. The IFS and the Fabian Society, sounds a bit like a theatre group to me, but it's a left-wing think tank, are calling for a reduction to £100,000. That would save £2 billion in tax to the government. The problem, though, is if you change this PCLS entitlement, how does that impact on people's reasonable expectations? people who have invested in pensions to get tax-free cash to repay a mortgage. You may have to introduce a dual system. So the question is, should people draw their tax-free cash now, before the budget? Well, I think if they've been considering doing it, they might as well do it, provided they've got something to do with it, like gift it on to the next generation or put it into a trust arrangement. What they shouldn't do is just draw it out and stick it in their bank account, because then it's in a very tax unfavourable area. And of course, your pension scheme is currently free of inheritance tax, isn't it? So you're bringing it back into your estate. But I certainly feel that if people are thinking about making gifts to their children, grandchildren, and they've got entitlement to considerable tax-free cash, they should consider doing that now. Be careful if clients have got an election on tax-free cash, for example, enhanced protection, because currently the revenue rules aren't in place to give them that maximum entitlement to tax-free cash over the 268275. Okay, there's, if you're interested in this, there's a revenue bulletin on it dated, I think it was the 4th of April 2024, which sets out what's happening. They're bringing in new regulations. I don't think they've actually introduced those regulations yet to make sure that everybody's treated fairly. Right, in the last couple of minutes then, pensions and inheritance tax. We know that since 2015, pension death benefits have not been subject to inheritance tax, so the advice is draw down from other investments when you get into decumulation. Leave your pension fund intact because it's free of inheritance tax. Government are concerned that since the abolishment of the LTA, very wealthy people are just throwing money into their pension scheme as an inheritance tax planning tool. The Institute of Fiscal Studies say if we make pensions subject to inheritance tax, that would save the government £2 billion every year. I don't know how they get that figure because it's quite a complex area. The position is, of course, with pensions and death benefits, they're already subject to income tax. So if a lump sum is paid when a member dies 75 or over, that's subject to income tax. If he dies under 75 and the benefits are over the lump sum death benefit allowance, the excess is subject to income tax. As far as drawdown concerns, if the member dies age 75 or over and the death benefit's going to drawdown, beneficiary, the nominee, drawing out of that will pay income tax. So there is a form of taxation on death benefits already, so it'd be quite difficult, I think, to just come in and apply inheritance tax willy-nilly. I think probably what they'll be looking at is looking at reducing that age 75 to 70 for income tax on drawdown from a death benefit fund. You may recall about a year ago there was speculation this was happening because the Revenue had released a document which proposed this, but they quickly removed it. We might get that removal of the IHT exemption because this enables pension death benefits to cascade down the generation with no IHT, because the person entitled to the death benefit drawdown fund, that fund is not in his estate for inheritance tax. So you can just pass it on. We may get a review of that. That would be quite easy to do. And we might get a reduction in lump sum and death benefit allowance from 1,073,100 down to, say, I don't know, £500,000. That's what I think they might be considering. Property tax, council tax is in need of a review. There might be a restriction on CGT main residence relief. So if you've got a capital gain which is over £500,000, say, the excess is subject to CGT. Wouldn't be very popular, but it could happen. They might attack second properties again. And as I've already mentioned, they could introduce a wealth tax, but they seem to have dismissed this for the time being. So I think for those clients who are likely to be affected and were thinking about taking action anyway, it makes sense to take planning action now because changes are very unlikely to be retrospective. And that will enable your client to outrun the dark clouds of budget tax increases. So those are the learning outcomes. I hope you've taken something from what I've said. It's my own view, okay, and there's nobody else's. If you're interested in financial planning using trusts, we've just updated this book and there's a special £100 offer there if you use that quote. Yeah, finally, just something, I'm a Director of Trustee Support Services. So if you need any consultancy on trusts, existing trusts, or you need deeds of appointment, deeds of variation into trust, stuff like that, that's what we do. We deal with a number of financial advisors in that area. It's a disclaimer, and just read this to you because it was quite interesting. I'm wondering whether Keir Starmer should be using this to finish off his speech today. Our best days are yet to come. Our proudest moments are yet to be. Our most glorious achievements are just ahead. That's a quote from Ronald Reagan on the other side of this wall. Anyway, thank you for your attention. Any questions at all? Or are you all ready for lunch? So,
If they were to make drawdown under IHT, would they not have to change trust law to do that, given that the master trust under which they're inherited currently says, or I don't know, I'm not a tax person, but the understanding upon which it was set up?
no, because this is my view on this. Section 3.3 of the Inheritance Tax Act, that is a provision which says that the omission to exercise a right rule doesn't apply to pension schemes. So prior to 2015, 2016 it did. And 2016 there was legislation which extended that section, which said that if you're in a drawdown position and you're either a nominee, a dependent or a successor, you would not be considered to be omitting to exercise a right by not drawing the money out the fund. So you just leave it there, name another successor, and that person stands in your shoes on your death. So you've got this amazing situation with drawdown on death benefits, that you're able to draw it all down at any point in time, but it's not in your estate for inheritance tax. Yet, if you get divorced, it would be treated as a financial asset for divorce purposes. So I think if they change that, that would deal with it personally. Yeah.
Do you think that HMRC has the capacity, capability to be able to affect a lot of these changes? From what I'm hearing, they're in a complete mess. And basically, a lot of these are the policy requirements, manpower. I think with IHT, they need to be thinking a lot longer, sort of 5 to 10 years. And that's not going to be probably their focus initially.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good point, because you've got to have the administration to deal with these changes. That could be one of the reasons we've had such a long run-in for the budget, so they make sure that they can deal with this immediately. I've been trying to get hold of somebody in HMRC who's quite high on the pension side for ages. Just can't get hold of him. So I'm reckoning that he's locked in meetings looking at any potential changes. But you're quite right, and with inheritance tax, you could extend the period of freezing on the nil rate ban, thank you, the nil rate ban, residence nil rate ban, and that would give you some income. And I think it would be quite easy to get rid of pets as well, if I'm being honest.
Tax on pets?
Well, no, just get rid of pets.
Because we're talking about putting a limit on the pets, weren't they, as well?
Yeah.
There's a lifetime gifting limit.
So that's why it makes sense for people now to make gifts. And they might need to take out life assurance to cover any potential IHT on the gift. But you can always do that later, can't you? Get the gift made before budget day, then fix up your inter vivos life insurance or level term insurance, yeah?
And what about, do you think about the change of the classification for BPR from 51% up to entrepreneurial to 80% in order to claim the exemption?
Yeah, that's possible, definitely, yeah. I mean, it's something that's on the table, isn't it? All of this with BPR, we don't know quite which way they'll go. But I think the other area with BPR, there's a lot of abuse on it, on investment companies. You know, investment companies are then invest in business property and get some business property relief on it. And it's quite blurry around the edges as to how the rules apply there.
Do you think quoted versus unquoted is where the lines would draw? So they would make a change more on the AIM side, and they would maybe increase the period to 3 years or something, and they would the enlisted side. Because the enlisted side seems to be that you would end up creating an issue whereby private companies would have to go for valuation that would bog down the probate, system even more. And we all know that that's a mess. So it seems to me like that it's easier on the AIM side.
The probate system's getting easier, actually. But I saw something released the other day where, you know, the inheritance tax people, the HMRC inheritance tax, now give a code, and this has considerably speeded up the probate process. But
not complicated cases, they're still getting aren't they?
Yeah. I think, as I said during the lecture, I think they've got to be very careful about making changes to AIM because they don't want to destabilise that market, you know, and that could have serious repercussions. So they might be wanting to give a little bit more thought to that.
Actually, they'll do a white paper on this before they go anything like this capital.
Yeah, there could be. Yeah.
And that's what we're more likely to see, aren't we?
But they don't seem to be into consultation because a lot of city law firms felt there should have been consultation on the non-dom changes. Yeah. And there's been nothing. There was a paper released on the 8th of August saying this is what we're going to do, wait until budget day and we'll release another paper then.
So I'm going to have to interrupt. John is going to be around during lunch, so if there's any more questions, feel free to grab them then. Look, thank you to John, thank you to Rebecca, thank you all for attending. Some kind of closing remarks and some summary comments based on what we've seen today. I think from Rebecca's perspective, it's going to be a painful budget. We're expecting that. The US are clearly very important, and risk tolerance and questionnaires ahead of investing is going to become even more paramount than it currently is. From John's session, make contributions and pension commencement lump sums, crystallise losses and make some large gifts and consider relief investments. That's it for today. In order for us to make these events successful, this is the first of a number around the country. Please scan the QR code. Thank you all. Sorry. And then a shameless product push. You've all had some coffee on your seat. That comes from one of our VCT investment companies called 200 Degrees Coffee that's created lots of jobs in Nottingham. Please feel free to take one home. Our Foresight Technology VCT is currently open for investment. Our 2 generalist VCTs are going to open soon. We have an EIS and we have 2 inheritance tax business relief products. Your business development manager will be in contact with you post this session. Expect a phone call. Thank you all.